it's a pleasure to be hosting an evening of learning. On the other hand, the circumstances which bring us together are the saddest of circumstances. It's a pleasure to be hosting Rav Khan, who's come from the Gush, to have my rabbinic friends and colleagues, Dayan, present. I was never a student of Rav Aharon, never a student in the Gush. I have some connections with it. My son attended it, many of my friends went there. But immediately I heard of Rav Aharon's passing, I was filled with a profound and immediate sense of loss. And one of those who has enjoyed everything that the yeshiva has put together online, the resources it's made available, the learning that it has offered to the world, and the inspiration directly and indirectly. Rav Aharon is one of those who had a certain halo effect. The things which connected with him elevated those who were connected to him. And the love of the Jewish people as a whole, which he radiated, have been inspirational. I looked at the resources available. What did Rav Aharon say about loss? There is one piece that is his commentary on a brand plucked from the fire, Ud Mutzal Me'ha'esh, his commentary on Asra B'Tevet, and his thoughts on the Shoah, in which he writes, somewhat prophetically, I suppose, when one faces death, so this is a translation, when one faces death, one begins to think in a different way. This is part of what should characterize us. We must think principally in terms of mission and calling. So how does Rav Aharon, in his own words, in this particular sikha, address loss and mission and calling? He says there are three particular ways we respond to loss and tragedy. One, responding with humility. Two, responding with commitment. And three, recognizing that our response, and here he's talking with reference to the Shoah, but it has wider application, should be more than mere survival. He says, and I'm quoting now from his words, we are exhorted to draw conclusions from the events and their causes, and it's our responsibility to learn lessons for the future. Responding with humility. The first thing that's required when relating to loss is absolute humility and complete self-nullification. First and foremost, he says, I refer to humility in relationship to the Almighty. This means avoiding all those philosophical and theological statements issued from all sides with great pretension, seeking to provide one or other explanation when the best response may be silence. And he tells a story about his neighbor, the poet Rav Lichtenstein Zal, who walked through the valley of death, experienced firsthand the Shoah and its horrors, and later wrote about it. And once a woman approached him, seeking to provoke him, and where was God during the Holocaust? Reb Leib looked directly at her and replied, Mit uns, God was with us. Where is God when we feel loss? Where is God when we feel tragedy? Where is God at this moment for us? Mit uns, with us. For a believing Jew, says Rav Aharon, this is the only answer that we should be given, not because it solves all the questions and doubts, but because it does not pretend to do so. It places the whole picture in the perspective of the divine presence in exile. I shall be with them in this their time of trouble, and likewise be with them in other times of trouble. There is no other answer. And he says, responding with commitment. The essence of our response must be to understand and accept the tasks entrusted to us, and to recognize their significance on the personal and the national level. Loss challenges us and addresses us as Jews and as a Jewish people. This response has two roots: the fact of the loss and the responsibility arising from survival. A person living in this generation cannot, under any circumstances, choose a path, make decisions, or plan his or her future while completely ignoring the loss, the flames, and the salvation. So what is it that we need to do that is beyond just survival? Since time immemorial, says Rav Aaron, we have existed for the sake of certain goals: to realize a vision, to make God king over the world, to serve him as a nation with special consciousness and with a special mission. We must keep in mind that there is no greater crime than thinking that the central message of a dark period in our history is only that we must go on living without establishing for what or how. So how does the Ben Torah, the inspired Talmud of Rav Aaron, go on? Here he writes, when one faces death, one begins to think in a different way. This is part of what should characterize us. We must think principally in terms of mission and calling, and he defines our mission and our calling. 3 tasks require our attention at present, and I believe these tasks speak to us this evening. The first arises from our being Shluchei Rahmana, God's emissaries. God has entrusted us with a mission, namely to address the problems of our generation. As far as possible, we must perfect ourselves, strive to bring about the repair of the world. We are, he says, Shluchei Didan, emissaries of man. We have another mission, not just perfection of ourselves, but building the land of Israel and building the state of Israel with all, he says, that these entail. And then beyond survival, the burden of continuity. He goes back to his neighbor, Rab Leib Rothman. Says he came from a town whose inhabitants were almost all observant Jews, yet he abandoned the path of observance in his youth. During the Shoah, he hid for many months in an attic, and one Shabbat afternoon, he remembered how in his hometown, before the war, the community would gather in the synagogue for Sudah Shlishit and sing Shabbat songs. And he wondered who is singing there now? And the answer, of course, after the Shoah was no one. The town was completely destroyed, and suddenly he sensed that he was the only survivor of the town, and that therefore he had to sing the songs of the town that had been silenced. On the spot, he did tshuva and began to sing. Concludes Rav Aaron, we must live the present with a profound existential connection to both past and future, looking back over dark, difficult times, but also anticipating with faith and hope the days that are coming that God promises, which will be better. All of our ways, all of our paths must be directed towards a life of faith with a sense of mission and calling. Rav Aaron lived his life with a sense of mission and calling. His mission was an education, his calling was an elevation. And we who continue to live and survive inspired have the mission of cherishing the memory and calling out his words, furthering, not just stagnating in what he has taught. It is a pleasure to bring his words to the Kehillah here this evening, and it is a blessing that those who have learnt with him and from him directly are able to sing his song here in his memory and continue to inspire us, the Ilui Nishmato, and to the enduring elevation of his memory. I welcome you to Kinlos, Dayan, Rabbonim. Our pleasure to host you. May his memory be a blessing and an atonement for us all.
Amen.
On behalf of British Friends of Yeshiva Har Zion, thank you, Rabbi Lawrence, especially I know sort of injured, running up to the hospital, so special thank you for being with us this evening. We're first going to start with David Pruer, a former Talmud of the Yeshiva from the recent years.
Preparing a eulogy for Rav Lichtenstein Z, is an incredibly daunting and almost impossible task. Rav Lichtenstein himself was a master eulogizer. He deeply valued the ability to fully capture the unique qualities of the departed, and himself was exceptionally gifted at rendering the true inner beauty of a complex character. For Rav Lichtenstein, eulogies were to depict the entirety of the lost persona, to remember and honor the splendor of the individual and their distinctive contribution to the world. In his own eulogy written for Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Rav Lichtenstein lamented the popular tendency to settle for broad and personal exaggerations, quoting extensively from Gemaras and Torah sources, whilst saying little about the individuality and personality of the soul extinguished from this world. Rav Aaron was someone who transcended all my expectations of what it meant to be a rabbi, who excelled in so many diverse fields, whose knowledge of Torah was unsurpassed in depth, clarity, and rigor, whose humility could make one tear up, whose kindness and sensitivity knew no bounds, and whose religious devotion and Yiras Shamayim stood as a beacon of inspiration to all who knew him. Words cannot adequately encapsulate the true greatness he embodied, and the dark, harrowing void that has been created in his absence. I feel obligated to preface this hesped with the caveat that this perspective of Rav Lichtenstein is a collection of experiences and perceptions of a single Talmud who had the great fortune, the incalculable privilege of learning in Rav Aaron's yeshiva almost 10 years ago. Many others undeniably understand the depth and breadth of his thought much better than I could hope, and knew him on a much more personal level than I ever did. And yet, I count myself blessed to have had the opportunity of spending a number of my formative years in his Beit Midrash. Rav Aaron changed my life in perhaps the most profound ways possible. He opened me to a Judaism that demanded the very greatest devotion. He inculcated within me a responsibility towards the world around me. He presented a Judaism of the most profound depth. He showed me that Judaism spoke to the problems of the present, and he embodied my own connection between Moshe Rabbeinu, this great sages of the Jewish tradition, and the present. Rav Aaron meant the world to me, and I can only hope to express a fraction of his persona and his impact upon me. One of the things I personally remember most vividly about Rav Aaron was his special dedication to his Talmidim and his approach to education. I remember seeking for Rav Aaron's counsel on a number of occasions. Charged and impatient, I approached Rav Aaron hoping for a clear answer to resolve the quandary puzzling a yeshiva student in his late teens. After posing my questions, Rav Aaron would invariably reformulate my query much more profoundly and sharply than I had ever originally intended. Then, rather than offering a simple answer, Rav Aaron would subsequently proceed to present a wide range of possible solutions, allowing the manifold voices of the Jewish tradition to bear upon the dilemmas that are at hand. Rav Aaron was ardent in his commitment to truth. He added qualification upon qualification to his responses, and refused to deny the multifaceted nature of any problem. Rav Aaron was almost constitutionally incapable of representing only one side of any story. Rav Aaron believed that authentic education did not mask truths from students by presenting simple, one-sided solutions. Whilst eminently frustrating for us in yeshiva, Rav Aaron encouraged his Talmidim to fully confront the complexity of life situations, to empower us through knowledge rather than satisfying oneself with half-truths. Not only would Talmidim walk away feeling more confused than before, learning of more considerations than one ever knew existed, but they would also leave somewhat disappointed that Rav Aaron had failed to provide a clear decision. Rav Aaron not only wanted us to appreciate all sides of a problem, but also almost always refused to make decisions for us. Rav Aaron believed in us. He wanted us to take responsibility for our own actions. Whilst frustrating for teenagers seeking clear answers and immediate guidance, in his wisdom, Rav Aaron realized that cultivating independent, mature, and responsible Talmidim was the educational priority. Rav Aaron's dedication to his students was reflected in his shir style too. Rav Aaron's shir yomid was never merely a lecture where students passively jotted down the Rav's insight. Rav Aaron's shirim were always an interaction, a dialogue between Rav and Talmud, structured to unpack the depth of the sugya together, to teach students how to learn and think for themselves, rather than merely experiencing the final product. Rav Aaron always made time for his students and never made anyone feel as though they were keeping him from something else more important, even though we knew we really were. Whenever you spent time with Rav Aaron, he made sure to understand your challenges properly and would treat your questions with the utmost respect. Towards the end of my time at Gush, I had a meeting with Rav Lichtenstein to discuss my time at yeshiva and my goals for university. I mentioned to Rav Aaron that I was going to study history in London, and in his characteristically pensive tone, Rav Aaron insisted that I had to read Thomas Carlyle, the Scottish historian. Rav Lichtenstein felt that Carlyle, through his writings, powerfully illustrated the potential of man to change the world around him, to generate new ideas and to influence society. At the time, what impressed me was his knowledge of wider literature. Yet, upon reflection, what has perhaps been more meaningful for me in the long term was Rav Aharon's aspiration to view all of one's endeavors in life as moments of potential spiritual growth. Rav Aharon taught me that my own university studies, and indeed all my endeavors in life, can contribute to the development of my broader religious personality too. No undertaking, Rav Aharon believed, should be embarked upon thoughtlessly without consideration. One of the most inspiring facets of Rav Lichtenstein's personality was his profound sense of responsibility to the Jewish people, which ran deep through his veins. In his habitual straightforwardness, Rav Aharon saw communal obligations as obvious, as the default way of living life. Rav Aharon impressed upon his Talmidim the need to dedicate one's life towards one's community and the world around him, to educate wherever possible, and to do whatever one could, and then some more, to help better society at large. One of the most powerful shiurim I remember at Gush was Rav Aharon's Purim Sikha on the story of Esther. At the climax of the Megillah, Mordechai warns Esther that she faces an existential decision. She can focus on her own faith and be forgotten from history, or she can embrace her communal responsibilities and take action for her people. In Esther's own personal dilemma, Rav Lichtenstein saw the question all of us ought to face in our own lives. Do we look out for ourselves and for our own comfort, or do we ultimately choose to devote our lives to others? Rav Aharon embodied the life lived with responsibility towards the Jewish people, and impressed upon us the importance of living with selfless dedication to others. That sense of responsibility will remain with his Talmidim forever. Rav Aharon is perhaps best known for his complex thinking, for his unique ability to theoretically dissect any sugya or area of Jewish thought with the utmost clarity. Rav Aharon housed a breadth of knowledge, of Torah knowledge, and an incisive intellect which I have never witnessed before. Yet, this supreme capacity for complex, nuanced thinking was coupled with a deep inner religious thirst and a core energetic passion for Torah and life as a whole. What perhaps left a greater mark upon me than his commanding intellect was this powerful inner energy which was tangible in all he did. I distinctively remember Rav Aharon pacing the walls of the yeshiva to give a shiur, holding more svarim than seemed physically possible to bear. Whether standing throughout Yom Kippur or speaking for hours and hours on end, Rav Aharon had an unmatched stamina that was fueled by this deep wellspring of intense energy. For those who have the privilege of davening in Gush, the Yamim Noram, who can forget the way in which Rav Aharon stood in prayer for an entire day, with the intensity of one praying for one's very life? My encounter with Rav Aharon taught me that true Yirat Shamayim, fear of heaven, was not to remain an abstract concept, but was a lived reality. As Rav Aharon once wrote so eloquently, intellectual assent is essential, but at the personal level, it is generally not the key. In the final analysis, the source of faith is faith itself. And yet none of these great feats stopped him from being the most humble and indeed human person I've ever encountered. Rav Lichtenstein possessed an authentic egolessness. This genuine humility without a trace of pride was coupled and fueled by his respect for all around him. Rav Aharon would queue up and wash his dishes after a meal with the rest of the yeshiva like a normal person without a second thought. I was so touched to see the working staff of the yeshiva lined up and in tears when Rav Aharon's levaya passed them. Rav Aharon treated everyone he encountered, no matter who they were, with the utmost respect and dignity. During my second year in Gush, the English students had a private session with Rav Aharon, where he shared some personal reflections on family life and his role as Rosh Yeshiva and father. Rav Aharon made it clear that his duties to his family were never sacrificed by his communal position. Rav Aharon spoke fondly of how he went cycling with his children, learned with them individually each night, and helped them with their homework like a dutiful father always should. For Rav Aharon, the pursuit of Torah went hand in hand with the cultivation of one's moral and human personality. Rav Aharon also loved poetry, which for him helped express the deepest of human emotions. I will forever remember the day that Rav Aharon posted a poem by Robert Frost on the walls of the Beit Midrash, after expressing shock that one of his Talmidim was unaware of its existence. The poem finishes with the following lines: "The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep." Analyzing these lines in a sikha later that day, Rav Aharon said, "Creativity is endless and life is short. Nevertheless, the narrator longs to remain in the snow, by the woods. But he has promises to keep and miles to go before he sleeps. And this sleep, of course, is death." Like the narrator of the poem, Rav Aharon felt the sense of responsibility, the promises he had to keep, which he kept with the utmost devotion until his final days. Before finishing, I would just like to share a short Dvar Torah from Rav Aharon on this week's paragraph, which is particularly pertinent to who Rav Aharon was as a person. The parasha details the extensive avodah of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. The avodah on Yom Kippur was particularly meaningful for Rav Aaron, who would legendarily teach these halachot of avodas Yom Kippurim on Yom Kippur evening until the very last Talmud left the base, no matter how late it was. In this parasha, the Torah introduces these manifold laws by referencing the deaths of Aaron's sons, Nadav and Abihu. Why, however, does the Torah place these two distinct ideas in close proximity? What is the connection between the deaths of Nadav and Abihu and the Kohen Gadol's obligations on Yom Kippur? Rav Aaron raised two possible solutions to this problem. One, that Nadav and Abihu's actions were problematic because they pursued their own religious hunger without considering the wider community. They pursued a personal vision without thought of the collective. The avodah of the Kohen Gadol, by contrast, provides the message that the ultimate and ideal religious act in Judaism is one which takes place at the communal level, with the active participation of the entire congregation. Rav Aaron also provided a second answer, stating that the danger underlying Aaron's son's actions was that unbridled personal religious passion can lead to the breaching of barriers and the loss of fear of heaven, the reality that a huge expanse separates the human from the divine. Therefore, to correct the sin of Nadav and Abihu, the Kohen Gadol was commanded a series of extensive halachot to highlight and inculcate the correct balance between love and fear of heaven. These words are perhaps no more aptly spoken of than Rav Aaron himself, who lived his life in complete service of the klal, the community, and did so with a deep love for and staunch obedience to the halachic system. In a world increasingly skeptical of religion's value, and where true Yirat Shamayim is ever harder to find, the loss of Rav Aaron is tragically deep and profound. However, when I once asked him how best to respond to catastrophe, Rav Aaron was always resolute. One ought to deeply mourn the loss and appreciate the magnitude of the hurt. Yet, that loss should always impel one to critical self-analysis and ultimately inspire the achievement of greater heights. Rav Aaron lived tirelessly by that axiom every day of his life. May his memory propel and stimulate us to do better, to push ourselves further, and may his legacy forever provide the guiding light that awakens the very best within ourselves. Thank you,
Dave. We're next going to hear from Rabbi Daniel Epstein, Rob at Cockbusters.
I'm Simon of Roselaw, Oren Asra, Jeremy Lawrence, fellow Rabbanim, alumni of Yeshivat Har Etzion, Bemidrash Nashim Fellows, Morai v'Rabotai, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I want to acknowledge Rav Yair Khan, who made the trip from Yeshivat Har Etzion just a few hours ago to be with us in London and give us chizuk this evening. When I started in Yeshiva in Tafshin Nun Bet in 1991-92, I was not in Rav Yair's shir. I was 2 shiurim above my station. I started in Rav Moshe Egelman's shir, and then moved to Rav Mordechai Friedman's shir. And I remember wanting to be able to move up to Rav Yair's shir, but not quite making it. They were all approachable and kind, and despite my lowly beginnings in this immense world of high-octane Torah, I was made to feel accepted and respected for being in the Bet Midrash. But what do I remember of Rav Yair is actually being able to go over to your makom in the Bet Midrash, a couple of rows away. I sat right underneath the thermostat, and just sitting down with you to talk. I was 19, I was from England. What did I know about yeshiva? What did I know about the world? But you took the time to talk to me and to answer my questions, and you seemed to have all the time in the world to do so. And I remember one particular line you said, amongst many things that have stayed with me since then. You spoke about going on a trip to the United States and meeting up with the alumni of the yeshiva. And after meeting them and inquiring of their families, you asked what they were learning. And you weren't referring to university or to other avenues of knowledge. You wanted to know what they were learning. And then you were excited by their answers. And for years afterwards, and even now, I remember always making sure I was learning, whether it was Gemara or Jewish thought or philosophy, just in case I bumped into you. So that if you asked me, what are you learning? At least I wouldn't let you down. And to Rav Daniel Roselai, who since I started in my position in the slightly older community of Cockfosters and then Southgate, as the Rav and Posek for the United Synagogue Burial Society, we've spoken on many occasions. Along with Rav Danny Bella at the time, you had been in the Bet Midrash at Gush for several years before me and stayed several years after me. But you took the time to talk to me and to answer my questions and you seem to have all the time in the world to do so. And you continue to have time for me whenever I call with Sheilot, despite your own pressures and schedules with your Kehillah and Kinlos Kollel and many other things besides. And I want to thank you for looking after me in that respect. So from these opening words, you may ask, how is this related to our Rosh Yeshiva, to our teacher, to our guide, Rav Aaron? Having listened to many Hespedim over the last few days, many people, and often great Rabbanim in their own right, have described their intimate relationship with Rav Aaron over many years. So when Rav Roselar asked me to speak this evening, I was nervous. I do not have scores of stories about how the Rav impacted my life, or essays on how I would personally have responded to the concept of an ethic independent of the halakha, or hours of personal conversation with a true giant of our generation. But I did ask the Rav a seemingly innocuous question, which I thought would require a two-word answer. I walked with trepidation, as we've heard already, towards the front right-hand side of the Bet Midrash, and waited quietly for a few seconds, until the Rav stopped reading the Gemara and looked up at me. How many days Yom Tov shall I keep on Sukkot? My heart was in my throat. Who am I to bother the Rosh Yeshiva with my daft questions? At least maybe I should have waited until I had a really good question to ask. The Rav asked me my name, and asked me to pull up a chair, and he then proceeded to explain with exquisite brevity the entire gamut of collective halachic thought on the topic. I thanked him, and walked away convinced I had to find a way to simultaneously observe every single psak at the same time. But Rav Aaron, you took the time to talk to me and answer my questions, and you seemed to have all the time in the world to do so. And I had spoken with my image of greatness, and this greatness was kind and gentle, and only there for me. But I did take some things away from yeshiva, and they were implanted in me as a small seed by Rav Aaron. The first was a sense of serenity and calm. Many situations generate a lot of noise, not necessarily physical noise, but superfluity and distraction from the issues at heart. And despite the emotion and excitement that was raging in the multiple fields of situations or parshiot in Israeli society, or the world of Torah, the Rav would approach them from a position of readiness and relationship. There was a confidence that came from extraordinary learning, but also tremendous faith. The tools at his disposal would be able to be brought to bear on each subject, and a critical, considered opinion could be formulated by careful and often brilliant application of the concepts, shitot, and the halachic precedents in order to arrive at an orderly conclusion. Even as a teenager, I found this extremely powerful emotion, which has informed multiple areas of my life. As I got older, it was this knowledge that the tools and the learning existed to access and reconcile a myriad of situations and dilemmas that gave me the personal conviction not to be afraid to engage with or consider some of the most difficult questions we face today. Although I may not possess the knowledge or ability to address the issues on my own, my confidence came from knowing that you and your Torah were there for me, whether in person, in spirit, or in print. And there were two words that Rav Aaron used in his sichot or his writings that I never appreciated the measure of until recently. The phrase was Knesset Israel, the community of Israel. And it was not just a definition, it was a philosophy. And I've not heard them used before, and they had a special ring to them that has intrigued me ever since I first heard him use them. I wanted to understand exactly what Rav Aaron meant when he used them, especially as the phrase does not occur even once in the entire Tanakh. I came to understand that the term Knesset Israel, for me, encapsulated the entirety of the Jewish people. It was Rav Aaron's shorthand, not just as a description of the numerical set of Jews in the world, but as a view of Torah and Halakha as being a viable, robust construct that is capable of including within it the entire Jewish people. There were two places where I drew tremendous inner strength from the use of this phrase, one from the Talmud, and one from the Rav's writings about Hesder, the program for yeshiva students that combines army service and Torah study into a 5-year framework. The Gemara in Masechet Brachot, Daf Lamed Hey Amud Aleph, says, Tanu Rabbanan, Asur lo la'adam sheyiheneh min ha'olam hazeh b'lo bracha, v'chol ha'neheneh min ha'olam hazeh b'lo bracha ma'al. Our rabbis have taught it's forbidden for man to enjoy anything of this world without a bracha, And if anyone enjoys anything of this world without a bracha, he commits sacrilege, ma'at, me'ilah. He has made use of something that is hektish, dedicated to Hashem, for non-Kodesh purposes. And continuing the Gemara, Rav Chanina bar Papa commented, Amar Rav Chanina bar Papa, Kol hanehene min ha'olam hazeh b'lo baracha, ki'ilu gozel hakadosh baruch hu knesset Yisrael, shne'emar gozel aviv v'imo. V'omer ani poshea, chaver hu li'ish mashchit, ve'ein aviv el hakadosh baruch hu, shne'emar halo hu avicha konech, ve'ein imo el knesset Yisrael, shne'emar shema b'ni musar avicha, va'al titosh torat imecha. Rav Chanina bar Papa said, to enjoy this world without a bracha is like robbing the Holy One, blessed be He, and the community of Israel. As it says, whoever robs his father or his mother and says it is not a crime, ein pesha, it is the same as a friend of someone who destroys. And when it uses the word father, it is none other than Hashem himself. As it says, is he not your father who has acquired you? And when it says mother, it is none other than the community of Israel, as it says, hear my son, the instruction of your father, and do not forsake the teaching of your mother. Reading Rav Aaron's position paper on the importance of Hesed as a viable synthesis of Torah and learning and national service, he used a phrase which crystallized his essence when tackling challenges of reconciliation. How do you communicate two equally important ideas which seem to contradict each other? He wrote that the students grappling with the concept of whether to participate in the Hesed program were not belittling the importance of Torah. They were emphasizing the centrality of the community of Israel a lot more. I want to read you the original in Hebrew because can't encapsulate things unless we get a sense of how he described them so beautifully. He says, ההסדר במיטבו שואף למשוך ולפתח בני תורה בעלי רצון עז ומקיף, להיות תלמידי חכמים, אך המרגישים בו זמנית חייבים, מוסרית והלכתית, לעזור ולהגן על עמם ומולדתם, הרואים במחויבותם הכפולה, בהתחשב באילוצים ההיסטוריים של מקומם ושעתם, זכות וחובה גם יחד. האוהבים בהשוואה לעמיתי